I guess we should get started. Welcome to the beta reading and critique panel. I believe we should just start by going down the line, introducing ourselves. You want to start on our left?
Sure. Hi, my name is Alkani. I help run a writing workshop, and I also have been doing critiques and various other things for folks for a number of years. I participate in a local writing group where critique is given quite extensively, and obviously as part of my job for the writing workshop as reviewing submitter stories and then providing critique on them, that is something I've been doing for 4+ years now, quite extensively. So those are kind of my qualifications and why I'm here on the panel.
Hi, I'm Skunk Bomb. I've been writing in the fandom since 2015. I'm in the same writing group as Sir Holt, and I've been doing beta reading and critiquing even in college, where I was a writing major and I took a number of workshop-related classes.
My name is James L. Steele, and Taganar. I have published a number of books. I have been on the receiving end of critique and feedback, and I have also given some in return. And I've received good feedback and bad feedback, and I'm here to tell everybody what authors are looking for when it comes to feedback.
I think a good place to start for this panel is tossing out what is beta reading, because I feel like some people get caught up on definitions. Like some people will think it's mostly going through and checking for grammar and spelling, when beta reading is actually a lot more involved. For me, beta reading doesn't really focus so much on the spelling and the punctuation marks. It focuses more on development. What you're trying to develop the story, you're trying to develop also the weaker aspects that are in a person's story without tearing them down completely and making them feel completely awful.
Yeah, so I think I ditto Skunk Bomb on that. So the whole point of a beta read is you're providing feedback to the author. Sometimes authors will have specific things that they want feedback on, or very particular things in addition to the general feedback. But a lot of the times it's just, hey, can you please look over my story and let me know where you find shortfalls or where you find strong points. What did you like? What didn't you like? What do you think works with the story? How does it flow? Do these characters feel one-dimensional? Do they feel like they're fully fleshed out characters? So a beta read is just your take on what this author's story is and how you feel it could be improved if it was your story, or where it's already pretty strong.
A good beta read definitely should tell the author specifically what you liked about it. I've given my stories to numerous people, and the worst feedback you could give an author is, yeah, it was all right, I liked it. The author is looking for something more specific than that. Like, is this paragraph necessary? Does this element fit in with the rest of the story? You need to be a writer of critique, and you can't just tell the author a blanket, yeah, this makes sense, or this doesn't make sense, or it doesn't work for me. You need to be specific, and authors are looking for that in order to improve the story.
Yeah. And going off of that, maybe we should discuss now what we personally are looking for when we are receiving or potentially giving out a beta read to somebody. For me, when I would say a good beta read is one where both writers are sort of on the same page on the level of critique that is going into it. I think a good beta read is also also great when you come to the beta read with specific questions about your story, like, hey, how does setting feel here? I felt like it was kind of weak when I was writing it. Does the character motivation work for the protagonist? Does the antagonist feel one note? When you come with those specific questions, I feel like you get a lot more answers, because sometimes you'll get feedback from from fellow writers, and it'll be great feedback, but they may miss a specific element that you're looking to have answered in the beta. So don't be afraid to speak up when you receive a beta from someone.
Okay, I'll go next, I guess. Something to keep in mind for critique is critique should be honest but not cruel as well. So whenever when I as a writer submit something out for a beta read, and let's say I say, I just need to get your general impressions on that. There are definitely things that you should be looking for in the story, but what's most important is one, what your perceptions and your feelings are, because the important thing about being a beta reader and a critique is that your read is always valid. You may interpret something in the text differently than what the author intended, which, if the author's intent, authorial intent, but the idea there is that you may have seen things or may see things that the author does not see because they are too close to the text. So from a critique perspective, that is important to keep in mind, that your read is valid and anything that you point out can potentially be useful to the author. Something else to think about too is that just because you give a piece of advice doesn't mean that the author is obligated to take it. So just like the author should be willing to listen to your advice, and it's a two-way street. So just make sure that when you are delivering that critique, regardless of whether there is a story element that just did not really satisfy you, for example, let's say you read it and the ending was dissatisfying because it didn't feel like there was a significant enough character change to warrant that ending. Basically, the ending wasn't earned, for example. Or let's say that a character feels like it's just there as set dressing and they're really not supposed to be because they're one of the main characters in the story. Be compassionate and be kind in your feedback, but do be honest, because when an author asks someone to beta read their work, that is hey, I really trust you enough to give me the feedback that I need so I can help this story grow. Will you please help me? And it is a place where an author is vulnerable as well. So when people write stories, they put pieces of themselves in the story whether they realize it or not. So that kind of kindness but honesty and willingness to give feedback is really important.
Just going off of that, when someone is critiquing your story, they're critiquing the story, they are not critiquing you as a person. Sometimes, receiving a beta could feel a bit personal because of just how close the work is to you.
And that also means when an author is looking for critique, they're usually doing so because they themselves have a specific issue with the story, something in there that they themselves are not sure of. Now, when I seek critique or a beta read or even editing, I usually don't tell the other person what about it is or what I'm not sure about, because I want them to point it out to me, and if they see it, then I know it's a problem. But usually when it comes to critique, a good beta reader isn't going to tell you exactly that, but it's something you have to interpret. If their overall feedback of the entire story kind of gives you a general sense that something is wrong here, then you know that you have to address that. On the other hand, if you yourself are seeking somebody's feedback, and this also goes into story commissions and reviews and things like that, you do have to be willing to accept that. And yes, don't take it personally, and if you're giving critique, don't get personal. It is, that's vitally important, not to be personal.
And going off something you said earlier about, I think both of you sort of touched on this subject about when you, about receiving critique. I think you both mentioned, both sort of implied like one person, but I've found like, since I'm in a writing group, I get feedback from a number of people, and I get a number of opinions from people with different viewpoints. If one person, I think, says, hey, this might need to be fixed, but maybe your gut's saying, I'm not entirely sure about that, I mean, it's always okay to seek a second opinion, get it read by one or two other people. And if they're saying like, yeah, you do want to probably check that out and fix it, then it's probably a good idea to get that fixed. But if you get a variety of opinions, like one person had no opinion, one person thought it should be changed, one person loved it, that might be more up to your decision and how you're feeling in your gut.
Yeah, and in our writing group, we've certainly had a few stories where people have had very wide opinions on specific elements of the stories. And even at the writing workshop that I help administer, which is the Regional Anthropomorphic Writers Retreat, where we handle mostly short stories, there can be wide opinions, not just between the instructors and myself, but there can also be wide opinions in the other participants who are participating in the critique as well. And once again, this goes back to what I said, which is every read is a valid read, and that's okay. And as an author, it is up to the author to decide which pieces of feedback they're going to reconcile in and say, yes, these pieces of feedback I'm going to take and apply, and these I don't agree with, so I'm going to walk forward. At the end of the day, the critique from a beta read is advice, and you can give them that. You can give the author the advice that they have requested, but in the end, it's up to them to decide whether or not they're going to leverage it, to benefit or fault.
Yes, it's important to separate. It's important to separate the different types of feedback you're going to get. You might get one piece of feedback that is just one person's opinion on it, and then you might get a piece of feedback that will alert you to something that is genuinely wrong with the story. Some stories you write will not have anything, or won't have anything wrong with it specifically, but it just might not work for an individual person. And if you are a beta reader, you also need to take that into account, to recognize that your point of view may not necessarily be everybody else's opinion on this element. You could still flag it for the author. And as the author, if a beta reader does flag it, then you need to understand that it doesn't always mean that it's a problem. It could just mean that this person doesn't understand that, or that this person isn't quite sure about whether or not this works. It might work for somebody else, though, and you have to think about what the difference is between those kinds of feedback.
And to play off of that, it could also just be an indicator where, in cases where it is something that you were not expecting to come through in the writing. So there's also that, where you wrote it one way, like the author wrote it one way, but it came off entirely different to all of the audience. So
that's definitely
that is one of the things that authors rely on beta readers for that kind of information, because if you write something about that involves especially a potential parallel allegory to something in real life, so where, oops, were you intentionally trying to make this character, a pantomime of X bad thing, for example? Like, that is a good example. Like, was this character intended to portray this and decry it as bad via a political allegory? And it's like, that is a valid read of that work, and that's something that the author may not see. So, it's just, these are things that beta reading can make you more aware of as an author, because that's something that you may write a story and then you may not realize that, oh, this imagery can be interpreted this way. And that sometimes becomes a problem, especially with older works of fiction, where if they were written in a particular time period, now some of the imagery and language that's used is like, that's really not appropriate for public consumption. And the example of that I like kind of picking on is anything that involves, what's his name? Cthulhu. Whose name I can't remember now. H.P. Lovecraft, who had a lot of very racist propaganda within his books, and there was a lot of allegory in there. And you read that now, it's like, that's really awful. So that's one of the things to also be very careful about when you're writing stories is. Make sure that you do listen to your beta readers if they bring up questions like that, because it could be you never intended that, but it can be read that way, and that's important to take into account.
Going off of what you said earlier about something being something that someone writes and it's being taken completely in a direction they didn't expect by someone who's beta reading it. Have either of you written something and then had it beta, and then they just saw a completely like different viewpoint that you didn't even intend?
Yes, and a couple of times it's happened. Where actually, every book I've written has had at least one thing in there that I intended one way, and my test reader told me this sounded like something else. One particular example was the book. This book, Huvek, was during the editing process. The editor told me that I had used the number 200 a lot. Like there were 200 enemy soldiers coming. He saw 200 of this or 200 of that. But I wasn't conscious that I was using that number over and over and over. And he said, "Is this symbolic? Does this matter in the world somehow?" And he was confused by it. It wasn't anything offensive, it was just distracting how often the number came up. And I looked at that and I said, no, I didn't have any intent behind that. I don't remember why I did that. So I took his advice, and instead of trying to make it symbolic, I just changed about 3/4 of the instances to some other number, just to get rid of that repetition so nobody would think it was symbolic or trying to mean something.
I actually had I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I have an example too. So this is actually not for prose. This is actually for when I was in college a very long time ago at this point, I was taking a playwriting class in college, and we were required to write a one-act kind of monologue scene, and in that scene, the principal character is talking to another character who is implied to be off screen. And so one of the things that happened in the critique session after that was read was a number of people, someone just said, is he gay? Like, what's the deal? And then a lot of people were like, yeah, like I kind of read that, like this character felt gay. And at the time I wasn't exactly in the closet, but I was still kind of coming out and learning to be comfortable with myself. So that's a good example of a couple of things, which is an author inadvertently putting a piece of themselves into the prose that they're writing, but also not just that, but the reader is clearly picking up on something, even if it wasn't the author's intent to make it homoerotic in my case. So, that's a very good example of that.
I do have an example, but you with James, with your number talk, it reminded me of something I worked on in college. I did a novel writing class during my last year of college, and I was not aware that I was doing this, but one person who was giving me feedback said, "Skunk Bomb?" Well, she didn't call me Skunk Bomb because it was college. "Skunk Bomb, I need to know, does your protagonist have OCD? Because the number 3 kept coming up. He kept doing something 3 times. He did X so-and-so 3 times, and I was just sort of like trying not to laugh or react, because I'm supposed to stay silent during critique, but it's just amusing how certain things come through that you don't even intend. And with your earlier talk of like a certain character or a group representing something else, it was when the writing group was workshopping my What the Fox story. I had a character who was very, very against skunks, and it led several of the members of the writing group thinking that the skunks were supposed to represent the Jewish people, and the main character was a Nazi. Not the intent at all, but I'm using to hear that specific reading.
Was that valid critique, or was that a way the story could have been interpreted?
I mean, I'm not going to knock that certain reading. I mean, it's not what I intended at all, but everyone has their viewpoint.
There comes a point where you just have to say, okay, that person is just reading way too much into this. I'm not that bad.
But at the same time, though, like it's important, especially if you're in a writing group, to keep in mind that everybody's read is valid.
Right.
So that's the thing. It's the key thing there is really, as someone who's receiving critique, to take that critique and not invalidate it, and not invalidate their read. Because if one person can read it, then 10 or 100 other people can read that as well. Like there's always that possibility. There is a possibility that yes, it's just one person who reads that and that's them and that's okay. But that is a valid read, but it is ultimately up to you as the author to decide what to do with that, for better or worse, to your fault or to your advantage. So
something I touched on earlier was asking what you think was like giving a good critique, but I was also wondering, what do you think is bad or unhelpful critique? I think we've touched on vagueness not being very helpful, and of course just completely trashing a story is also not very good, but were there other sort of things that would be unhelpful when giving or receiving critique?
I'll go for that. I think, the worst critiques I've had have been from just general random readers. People in the writing group I used to be in. I gave this person a story of mine. I said, can you give me any feedback on this? And all the feedback he gave me was this story was all right. Yeah, that's not enough, but at least he didn't see anything wrong with it, so that's a bit helpful. But as an author, we always think that something is wrong with our work, and we're just waiting for somebody to tell us that. So when we don't get it, it's not a relief. It just means we think something even worse is wrong with the story, and this person is too polite to tell us. And that does happen a lot with feedback, and this is why I'm very choosy about who I'm giving stories to for critique. You have a question?
If you've accepted to take in a beta and you've gone through it, and you can't find anything meaningful, and it's not so much that you know that the story's perfect, but you just know that you may have overlooked something, is it be best to just contact the author and say, I've read through it, I enjoyed it, I was not able to find anything meaningful, perhaps you should seek other beta readers, and just basically communicate to them that you just don't feel that you're able to find what they need?
that is absolutely polite and that is absolutely acceptable. Like if you have read through a story and after reading it once, reading it twice, reading it even a third time if you have to, that's another important point of the that's another important thing about the beta process, but I can cover that in a little bit. That is absolutely the most respectful thing that you can do, is just to very politely say, like, hey, I really read your story, I enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it, but overall I couldn't find specific points to do that. That's absolutely reasonable. You don't have to say, I would recommend you find someone else. Just be honest. Just be honest and forthright, because once again, that's part of that kind of unspoken contract of the author trusting a beta reader to read the story for them and provide feedback, whether it's specific elements that they wanted to look at or just general feedback. And that's honoring and respecting that kind of silent contract that's between beta reader and author. So I think that would be perfectly acceptable.
I've had feedback like that too. But there is a difference between being vague about it, by just saying, yeah, it was all right, I liked it, and then coming out and saying that I could not find anything wrong with it. But even more helpful would be to expand on parts that you thought worked well. And because when an author is seeking feedback, they usually have something in there that they're doubting, or they're expecting that there's something in there that they're not seeing that's wrong with the story. And so if you can tell them that I liked this part, I liked this element, I especially liked this character, and I think that their development was good, that might touch on something that the author was in doubt about before. And now they've had confirmation that maybe they don't have to panic about that element as much as they thought because at least one person out there enjoyed it. So that kind of feedback is also useful, as long as you don't come across as being too polite to tell the author anything is wrong with it. Because there is a difference.
Right. While yes, it is helpful to give like critique. It's sort of like I'm blanking on the exact word I'm looking for, but if you can't find anything that they think they need to work on, then it definitely you should definitely let them know what you think is working, what you definitely enjoyed. And I feel like with any story that you read, there's always going to be at least one thing that you can pull out that's positive, or at least one thing that you could probably pull out, even if it's small, that they might need to work on.
But that is actually one of the hardest parts of critique. It's easy to point out stuff you don't like, but it's really hard to explain why you like something. And I've found that Amazon reviews are an excellent place to look for this. Like, it's easy to tear something apart, but it is very difficult to find good reviews that expand on what a person enjoyed about something. And this is true for movies, books, music, really anything. So if you can find good positive critique, that can be just as useful to an author as constructive criticism.
So to that effect, like one thing to keep in mind, I know that in our writing group, the way that we typically structure critique is we usually start off with a few positive things, and then we usually go into things to consider. So we also always are sure to construct the things to consider not as if it is directly attacking those things. So for example, if let's say person A wrote a story and I'm sitting in my writing group, it would be, okay, well, thank you for sharing your story. I really, something that I personally do, and this is the way I handle my face-to-face critiques, is thank you for sharing your story. If I had to summarize your story in a few lines, I would say, Bob is cursed with a literal gemstone helmet that he cannot get rid of. But Bob runs into this kobold. Will this kobold help him remove this helmet? Like, it just a synopsis of the story. Then usually what I personally do is I say, what were the elements of this story in which a character was against something? So this kind of goes back to really basic literary analysis where it's like, is this person versus person? Is this person versus society? Is this person versus idea, et cetera, et cetera? Then usually I go into, well, what I found really engaging was that Bob was a good, well-rounded, three-dimensional character. The kobold added some humor into the story, and the antics were generally good. There was sufficient tension in the story that led up to this emotional crisis that made the ending feel like it was satisfactory. So that might be 4 or 5 different things that were really good about the story. Then it'd be, but some things to consider. This feels a little bit like a Deus Ex Machina, and here are ways that if this were my story, I would consider fixing it. So, and then I would list off a few points, and then say, the other thing that I was really confused about was insert discontinuity. So for example, let's say one action happened here and one action here, but how did they get that power? What was the thing that was missing? So in general, that's how I structure my critiques, for example. And I've mentioned that now just to kind of give you all a vision of what exactly is meant by there's always something good to say, and there's always at least one good thing to say and one bad thing to say. And if you are new to doing beta reads, or if you are looking for a little bit more structure, that's something that can potentially help you give more structure to how it is that you think, how you're thinking when you're reading the story. The other thing I suggested was 1 or 2 passes, kind of indirectly. Usually when I do critique on a story, I will do a single first pass and just let the story sit for a day, or 2, or 3 sometimes. So then I'll go back and do a second pass with a critical eye. And the idea is that the first pass just lets the story sit, and it lets you just have the story sink into your brain so you can start thinking about it. This may not work for you, but it works for me at least. So these are some other ways that can kind of help with that whole element of, hey, don't just give, don't just point out all the bad stuff, but let the authors know the good things too. And that may be something that works for you all in terms of structuring your internal critique.
I wanted to go off a couple of things that you mentioned. Also, I feel like I try to do. I think it's been called the compliment sandwich, where not only do list what you think is working well in the beginning, and then you go into what you think could be improved, but also ending on something pretty what you think worked. It's just a nice way to end the critique. Nice to end on a good note rather than a not so good note. And another thing you said about when you mentioned if this were my story, going back on an earlier talk that we were having about what you think is an unhelpful critique. I feel like it is unhelpful when the beta reader starts to think, all right, let me try to rewrite your story as if I was the one writing this story, and then giving you feedback based on that.
Yeah.
You have to keep in mind that you were giving the critique of someone who has a different style than you, and sometimes they'll do certain different things that aren't necessarily like wrong, they're just different.
Yeah, sorry, and to quickly address the unhelpful thing real quick, some of the critique that I've gotten before that was a little unhelpful was something that sat kind of right in the middle between being too vague and not at all specific. So it was like not quite vague, but not quite specific enough. My suggestion for that would be, don't be afraid to just be specific. And if you have examples of why it is that you think, the more information that you can provide, usually in a structured way, the more helpful it can be. So for example, if you take issue with the way that that 3 paragraphs are structured and ordered, say if this was my story, I think that this order would work if this paragraph was here and this paragraph was here. Like, that's totally reasonable and okay. And that will at least give the author the opportunity to go back and review and say, yes, let me try doing it this way, or will it work this other completely different way, since this person brought this up.
I also just noticed that we have roughly about 15 minutes left in the panel. We've been talking for a while and we haven't gotten too many questions from the audience, so are there any questions that we can answer for you?
Yeah, y'all touched on this briefly. One of the problems I've had to critique is I want my beta readers to see something, but I don't necessarily want to point it out. Like, I don't want to say how old do you think this character is? Because I don't want them to read too much into it. But that's at the same time, I do need to know something specific. Do y'all know of a good way to nudge the beta readers into the right direction without giving them too much of a tip off or something like that?
If they don't ask, or if they don't mention it when they first give you feedback,
Yeah.
It can't hurt to ask them directly afterwards. That's usually what I do. I don't tell prospective beta readers exactly what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
I let them formulate their own opinion first. And then if they don't address something, I will ask them a specific question, like, what about this part? Did you notice anything about this? Sometimes prompting can help them feel more comfortable telling you something, because now they know that you're open to something specific.
Okay.
Because a lot of, some readers might not be thinking about that, but when you point it out, maybe they'll have something else to say about it. It can't hurt to ask.
I think it also depends on who your beta readers are. So if your beta readers are other writers, if you give specific prompts up front, I don't think that necessarily forces them to have a specific opinion. You could ask something as vague as, my biggest concerns are, do my characters feel three-dimensional? That is a vague enough question, and that is a broad enough question without saying, I need to know about this specific character. But it at least tells the reader, hey, I'm concerned about whether or not my characters in this story seem believable or not.
Yeah.
And I think that if you want to, so that you don't necessarily have to go back for a second pass and prompt your readers again, then that may be enough. It's if you have a writing group, you might be able to, like if you have a writing group it's also a little bit different there because with a writing group, you'll be face to face, and usually there's a time where you can ask questions. You can ask very specific questions to your writing group because in theory, they should know your writing style pretty well after a few sessions. So I think maybe that's the difference. Maybe James's approach will work if your beta readers principally aren't writers, and maybe the second approach will work if they are writers. You could always experiment with your beta readers and see which approach works.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Have you ever had to critique an author who became combative, and how did you deal with that?
Yes. Actually, I'm trying to think. Have I ever had to do that? I personally, now that I think about it, I personally have not had to deal with that. So I'm sorry. I'll withdraw. I have had a beta reader who has been rather nasty to me once, but that's a separate story, and that's not answering your question.
I would have to go probably as far back as maybe college to even think of a moment where that happened. No specific incidents really come to mind, unfortunately. I apologize.
I think authors are more likely to be combative in that case, because for the author, there's something at stake. For the beta reader, there's not, unless you have a relationship where you are going back and forth discussing a story, you might disagree with something. But I can't say I've ever had anything combative. There have been times when I felt strongly about a certain, a few paragraphs on something, and I was going back and forth with the editor explaining why I wanted this, why I didn't think this should be cut, and he would tell me this is why it should be cut, and I would say but, and he would say but.
I mean, to clarify, I was editing for a friend, so I wasn't getting anything out of it, and I was doing what I call kind of providing a commentary track, where I was just offering my thoughts as I was reading through it, and he started replying to each of my emails on a daily basis. I was kind of like, I'm doing this for free. If you want to question all my notes, go ahead, but I'm not really interested in engaging on this level.
So in retrospect, thought I have had someone where I did provide a beta read that had my specific notes on it, and then they came back and they said, well, this isn't correct because of this specific reason. So they weren't really being nasty combative about it, but they were being defensive about it. And this kind of goes back to that unspoken contract where it's every read is valid and critique that you receive is not obligatory for you to take. So it's one of those things where the way that the author could have handled that situation is by saying, hey, thanks for your critique, I appreciate it, and then just ignoring what it is that I'd said, and that would have been fine. What I basically ended up doing is I think I basically either replied back or maybe I didn't, but I do remember that specific situation where it was, I had done a beta swap with them, and they were a writer, and yeah, it was just, they were like, well, you don't get this and you don't get this, and it's like, no, that's not how this works. The way this works is everyone's read is valid, and it is up to you to decide whether you can take it or not. Accept this, which, as a bit of a side note, is what makes it really challenging to provide critique for excerpts, because for excerpts, there is so much context that is missing, and I specifically have this experience because of the writing workshop. For the first couple of years, we accepted excerpts. We no longer do that because excerpts are problematic in the sense that unless a chapter of a story is written as an entirely self-contained story, it doesn't work. And most chapters or excerpts are not written that way. So, if it's something like an excerpt, there's so much context that's missing that it's very difficult to pinpoint very specific elements and provide constructive feedback. So,
well, it's funny that you say that, because actually I ran the Writer's Slam here yesterday, and unfortunately at that point all we have to work with is excerpts. It's like, well, we'll provide the best critique we can.
Yeah.
1 to 2 pages.
Yeah, and it's like if that's the situation that you're stuck in, that's all you can do. You can go I'm going to preface this with, we don't have all the context here, so this is just me providing critique on what it is that I know about what was provided, and that's it. So,
going off of that, I've certainly seen this online, but if the ideal position is to, of course, hand in a story that is a complete story and not like an excerpt or the first few pages. I feel like sometimes writers will do that because they want sort of that like dopamine hit of, oh, I'm doing really well, I got praise.
yeah.
You got if you can please finish your story first, then ask for critique. It's much easier to get the overall it's easier to just get the overall story when you have a complete story. If you only have a portion of it, something you might suggest might not be helpful because it's then explained later on.
And I believe all of this applies not just to beta reading and critique, but it applies to reviews of finished work as well. Yeah. Who here actually listens to one sentence reviews on Amazon? I tend to ignore those as well, whether they're 5 stars or 1 star. I'm looking for something that is a little bit more than one sentence, like at least a paragraph or two, that explains, that cites evidence for what they liked about something, what they didn't like, if they had an issue with characters or something with pacing. Those kind of reviews I like, the constructively critical ones, and even the positive reviews that have a few points of criticism in them. Those are the ones I like because they're thoughtful. They're not just, yeah, it worked for me, or no, I didn't like this. That's what authors are looking for, and in both the beta reading stage and after the final product has been released. And reviews like that are very important to leave for authors, so please leave them for our work.
Yeah, getting the feedback of, this is legitimate feedback that I once got on a story. Getting the feedback of, that shiny red eject button, I'm licking it right now, is not helpful.
I see we have about 5 minutes left, so we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. How about you with the ears?
I was wondering if there's sort of like a minimum number of people that
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
How many beta readers do you use, and why do you use that number of beta readers?
I tried to get more than one because I like having just multiple points of view on a story. I mean, something that really speaks to one person might not speak at all to another person. I would say, but I would also say if you could only get one person's feedback, that's still fantastic. I would say, let me see, our current writing group is 7 people, I think?
Yes.
Yeah.
6 or 7.
6 or 7. I feel like that's definitely pushing the limit in terms of feedback on one story. If you try sending your story to a class of 12 or 20 people, unless it's for a class, so of course other students are going to be looking over it. But if you're tossing your story at 24 people, then you're probably going too far. So handful, that's pretty good. Even 1 is good, but not 20.
I'd say 2 or 3 people if you aren't very, if you don't know them very well, and if they're not very familiar with your work, or 1 person you really do trust with a good opinion on your work. That's generally what I go by, because I don't know enough people to get more than 1 person's feedback normally, but typically when I do request feedback on a story, it's from somebody I trust, and I will take their point of view. I give it a lot of weight, as opposed to 3 or 5 people who I'm not very familiar with.
Yeah, I will definitely agree. I generally try to circulate stories between 2 and 3 people, because I'm in a writing group, we're in the same writing group, so I have the advantage of having a group of people who are comfortable with each other's writing styles and who I know I can trust to provide reasonable critique that is not cruel, but that is honest, as I said before. So, which is one good reason why, if you aren't in a writing group, you might want to go consider looking for a writing group, because those are the people who can also potentially provide you consistent critique that is also, once again, to the honest, but not cruel. But yes, generally, the one story that I know I did with a bunch of author swaps with, it was 3 people, I believe. It's still in development hell, but that's okay. But the 3 people were able to give me enough useful feedback that I can go forth in the story and go, oh yeah, they have a point with X, Y, and Z, and so I can rebuild that story and then recirculate it for feedback with another group of people. I would say if you probably had to use rando Calrissians on the internet, then maybe you would want to increase that size a little bit, but I definitely would not go beyond 6 or 7. I did go to a writing workshop, a speculative fiction writing workshop in Houston, Texas called WriteFest. It was a really wonderful experience. There were about 10 people in the class, and that was a lot of note-taking to take for feedback on the story that I submitted to be workshopped. So that's the other thing too, is that is a lot of changes to have to make decisions about. So unless there are really clear patterns in thought, and unfortunately for these notes, there were a lot of varying patterns in thoughts. It was like, okay, well, where do I go? These are all numbers that don't really add up to anything. So the more feedback is good, more feedback is also potentially not good.
Yeah, if anyone has like a really quick question, because we're essentially almost at time. Yes?
One note and one maybe quick question. There actually is a Furry Writers Telegram chat. I would say it's kind of in the formative stages, but I did accidentally discover I was an admin of the group. So if people are curious about that, they can talk to me later, I guess. What are your views on beta reading for pay? Because I used to beta read for friends, and then when I asked them if they would do the same, they're like, I don't have the time for that. It was a bruising experience.
I have thoughts on not reciprocating beta reads, but I will let Scott go first.
I mean, like, Cerebral is in my writing group, so like I have close friends where it's like, hey, we're tight, I'll certainly do a beta read for you. But I'm also of the belief that, especially if you're dealing with people you don't particularly know, if you have a certain skill sets, you should get paid to do that work.
Yeah, certainly. It's something that people can charge for, especially if they're not expecting something like reciprocation. So I mean, that is the whole point of a service. Is it's like either in kind, which is payment of its own, or yes, you can pay for it, and if you know the person, then you might be more willing to pay for it, but nobody can blame you if you don't want to. So that's I think the caveat on that.
I would say you'd have to have some credentials or
Yeah.
some sort of you have to be kind of known as a good feedback giver in some way to get away with charging for something like that, because if you just hang a shingle up and say, I'll read your story for $5, if they don't know you and if they don't know what kind of feedback you give, you're not going to get a whole lot of takers on that. So that would be, I'm not sure how you would get started on that. I'm sure it's possible.
And that being said, I have actually paid someone for a beta read before, but they provided me very, very extensive feedback on it. So like that's a good example of.
And what led you to the decision to pay money for a beta read? Did you know who this person was?
I knew who this person was, and I knew that they were an editor. And despite the fact that English was not their native language, they still actually provided me very reasonable feedback for the story at the time.
Yeah.
So because they had previous editing experience, and because I knew them, that was what happened.
I believe we are at our time. I want to thank everyone for coming to the Beta and Critique panel. I hope you all have a good rest of your convention.